Good morning. I'm going to present to you the asset management policy, and I thank you all for coming for this presentation. My name is Reginald Ofori, and I'm Information Security Specialist, and I've put together the asset management policy for Dubai Smart Government, which in short I'll say is DSG. And this asset management policy I'll be presenting to you will be a policy for the IT infrastructure of the Dubai Smart Government. That's an example. And there's the policy document includes introduction, purpose, objectives, scope, policy statement. So the introduction in the document is that the DSG is responsible for ensuring the confidentiality and integrity and availability of the data that is processed and stores in its ICT system in order to provide its services and facilities. So therefore, the smart government has an obligation to put in place appropriate governance and control of its ICT assets relevant to the input, processing, and storing of information. There's an introduction to the reason why we have this policy. Then the purpose of this policy and standard document is based on the requirements of ICT asset management as defined in the ISO IEC 27001 2013, year 2013, section 8, which is asset management. So the purpose is the information systems services constitute valuable government resources. Therefore, the asset management policy establishes the blueprint to identify the rules of acceptable use and the rules for protection. We are protecting the assets. We have to identify what assets to protect, who protects them, and how much protection is adequate for these assets. The purpose is also to account for the assets that require protection. This policy specifies the requirement to designate who owns the assets, and the designated owners become responsible for protecting information and technology assets of the government and to maintain the way the assets are protected. The policy also set the foundation for a system that clarifies information to identify different security levels, to specify how much protection is expected and how much information should be handled at each level. Not all information requires the same level of protection because only some information is sensitive or confidential. Then let's look at the objective of this asset management policy. The objective of the policy is to state the government's intention and aspirations to govern and control the ICT assets required to support its services and facilities. The objective of the associated standard is to specify the method and operating parameters to be adopted, which is, if followed, will ensure compliance with the policy. And within the policy, we have the scope and out of scope. So when we talk of the scope, the policy and standard applies to all the persons who procure, manage, support, and use IT systems, facilities, and services with the government within the government's ICT infrastructure. These persons include, but are not limited to, members of staff of the the government IT division, employees of third parties, example, the companies, the organizations, agencies, and charities with which the government has a contractual arrangement with. Freelance and self-employed contractors with whom the government has contractual arrangements. Asset owners, asset managers, line managers, supervisors, and users of ICT assets within the scope of this policy and standards are also defined in the policy. For the purpose of this policy, assets are those which are defined as supported assets by the ISO 27005 and include but are not limited to network components, example switches, routers and firewalls, processing units, example like servers, workstation, tablets, and mobile phones, storage facilities like hard drives, removable disk drives, USB, and storage devices, peripheral equipment, which will be printers, scanners, multifunction devices, and telephone. Then the software, which will be covered in operating system, database management system, database application systems, internet browsers, anti-malware, and backup and recovery management on all devices and platforms, including SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, which are the cloud facilities or cloud infrastructure, and embedded software, where software purchases are made under the government's contracts. So what we will consider out of scope within is any ICT related asset that is not to be governed or managed as given in these policies is at the sole discretion of the director of ICT. So any assets given as a primary asset in Annex B of the ISO 27005, year 2011, note 9.1, such as business processes and activities and information. Assets given as support assets in Annex B of ISO 27005, 2011, and note 9.1, but are not within the remit of ICT service providers such as personnel, sites, and organizations structure. Now, the statement or the policy statement is the government will identify and create an environment of all ICT assets associated with information processing facilities. Ownership. We talk about ownership, responsibilities, processes, and procedures will be adopted and followed to ensure that the ICT asset inventory is accurate, up to date, consistent, and aligned with other inventories. All users and maintenance support staff will take due care and attention of their use of the government ICT assets to minimize the risk of their loss and theft and damage to them caused by misuse or mishandling. Line managers also will ensure that all ICT assets that are no longer required are returned to ICT, infrastructure, business service centers, customer support for all reallocation or disposal. So these, as the introduction, the purpose, objectives, scope, and out of scope, and the policy statement within the asset management policy document that I've written and I'm presenting to you. So to make you aware that within this policy document, we have the introduction, the purpose, objectives, the scope, and the policy document. Next, we have the asset management itself, which will be under responsibility for the assets, information classification, and media handling. So the responsibility of assets, so to identify the purpose or the goal is to identify organizational information assets and define appropriate protection responsibilities. Therefore, an inventory of all important assets associated with information system must be documented and maintained. A, identification of the assets. These functions must be performed within the government. Identification of assets, documenting and maintaining asset inventories. Loss, theft, or misappropriation of assets have to be in place. So let's look at identification of assets. So when we talk about identification of assets, we mean information owners must identify assets under their control, which will include the software, the hardware, including mobile devices and tablets. Information assets required to be inventoried in the Personal Information Directory, required under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. All other assets, including databases, data files, contracts and agreements, system documentation, research information, user manuals, training manuals, operational support procedures, continuity plans, fallback arrangements, and archive information. All of them have to be documented. They have to be identified. So we look at under responsibility for assets, the asset management. We look to have inventory of assets. The assets have to be registered, or let's say a register of assets. And within the inventory, assets associated with information processing facilities shall be identified, and an inventory of these assets shall be drawn up and maintained. Information owners and information custodians must document, maintain, and verify asset inventories on a regular basis, depending on the criticality and value of the assets, and validate the measures taken to protect the assets as part of an enterprise risk management strategy. The following information should be recorded to facilitate system planning and asset recovery in case of interruption, corruption, loss, disposal, or distraction. So this information I've written in the policy document. We have a spreadsheet which will be the register of the assets, and all these things will be in the spreadsheet. So the assets have to be under a type of, we have to list or document or register the type of the category of the asset, the owner of the asset owner, asset custodian, the format of the asset, location of the asset, backup information and location, license information, sensitivity and safeguard requirements, criticality for service delivery, maintaining business functions, consequence of loss, asset name, IP address, operating system or company application installed, supported selection process. Then lastly, the register or the inventory of the asset should include the valuation of the asset for overall asset value to determine the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Information owners and information custodians are accountable for asset identification, inventory, maintenance. They are also maintenance. Then we come to the point where we have to record, we have to take measures for loss, theft, or misappropriation of assets. And the loss or theft or misappropriation of assets must be reported immediately using the general incident or loss report. Where the loss, theft, or misappropriation involves information, the information incident management process must be followed. Ownership of assets. Assets maintained in the inventory shall be owned. All information assets must have a designated owner. An information owner is responsible for controlling the production, development, maintenance, use, and security of information and technology assets within their jurisdiction. Information owners are responsible for one, ensuring the appropriate classification and safeguarding of information and technology systems or services. They also have to define regularly and review access restrictions, classification, safeguards in accordance with applicable policies. The designation information custodians and ensuring that they have the correct tools for protecting designated assets. Then we come to the policy regarding acceptable use of assets. Rules for acceptable use of information and of assets, associated information process since facilities shall be identified, documented, and implemented. All users of the government information system must take responsibility for and accept the duty to actively protect government information and technology assets. Now, under responsibility for assets, we tend to return of assets. What do we do when we have to return assets? To ensure employees return physical information assets at termination or change of employment, all employees and external party users shall return all of the government assets in their possession upon termination of the employment, contract, or agreement. Supervisors must document and return of government assets in possession of employees upon termination of their employment using standard processes. Now, we look at classification of information classification under the asset management. The goal, objective is the classification of information is to ensure that information receives an appropriate level of protection in accordance with its importance to government and define the information security classification system, characteristics for information and information systems. All the information shall be classified in terms of legal requirements, the value, criticality, and sensitivity to unauthorized disclosure of or modification. The government information security classification system must consider the value, sensitivity, and intended use of information. Information and information system security classification, mandatory features of information security classification, mandatory features of information system security classification must be performed, must be written, and in a document, these are highlighted for your perusal. The label on mandatory features of information security classification, we have to apply to the information types rather than discrete data elements. Here we determine the relative value of information, including factors such as statutory or regulatory requirements, impact to health, life, or personal safety, effect of data aggregation, impact to the ministry service plan from loss of information confidentiality, integrity, and availability, changes to information sensitivity over time. Labeling of information, an appropriate set of procedures for information labeling shall be developed and implemented in accordance with the information classification scheme adopted by the government. Information must be labeled. Information must be labeled with when appropriate and handled in accordance with assigned information security classification and information labeling procedures and information handling procedures. All these must be labeled. Now, disposal of assets, disposal of media. It comes to a point that the government have to dispose some of its or use that media which are not needed anymore. So the procedure shall be implemented for the management of removable media in accordance with the classification scheme adopted by the government. Media shall be disposed of securely when no longer required, using formal procedures to ensure that risks to information introduced by portable storage devices are managed. All removable computer media must be managed with controls appropriate for the sensitivity of the data contained on that particular media. 1, management of government records, use of portable storage devices, human factors, risk assessment factors and controls, and mandatory controls must be implemented or must be looked into. So management of government records, a department must be responsible for disposal of government records. Corporate Information and Records Management Office should be responsible for the management and disposal of government records according to the record schedules approved under the Information Management Act. So let's look at how do we use mobile and portable storage devices. The use of mobile and portable storage devices like on your phones and your laptop to store or transport information increases the risk of information compromise. Therefore, these devices are typically small and are easily lost, stolen, or damaged, particularly when transported in a public environment. So mobile or portable storage devices include, but are not limited to USB drives, external hard drives, smartphones, tablets, laptops, and MP3 players. Then is the responsibility of information owners, information custodians, and supervisors to ensure that use of mobile or portable devices is managed and controlled to mitigate risk. Document processes for authorizing use of mobile or portable devices. Ensure employees using mobile portable devices protect information technology assets in their custody or control. So also information owners and information custodians must conduct a security threat and risk assessment on mobile devices or mobile computing services to determine the risk profile and suitability of the device or the service of government use prior to deployment within the government. Human factors has to be considered. Information owners and information custodians and supervisors must ensure employees using portable storage devices are aware of additional risk and responsibility inherent with portable storage devices, familiar with the required protection technologies and when they must be used. They have to be familiar with the information incident management process and general incident or loss reporting procedures. And they have to assess the risk. The threat, security threat, and risk assessment must consider the impact of disclosure or loss of information stored on portable media from threats such as loss of physical theft, limited ability to control and log access to stored data, accidental media disposal or destruction, improper long-term storage environment, exposure to malware, incomplete erasure of data prior to device disposal. Mandatory controls have to be a minimum information protection safeguards for the use of portable storage device must include for their use. Documented definition of information classification sensitivities permitted to exist on specific media types. We have to document portable devices handling procedures. We have to document portable storage devices, and there's a specific procedure we have to follow, which include off-site storage, third-party transportation, information backup, protection against malware, logging and of media custody and location to allow for accounting and audit. This all have to be considered. And then also, we have to secure disposal and destruction of media. What's the policy regarding the secure disposal and destruction of media? Media must be disposed of securely and in a manner appropriate for the sensitivity of the data it contains. Any asset capable of storing electronic information is considered a type of media, including mobile and storage, portable storage devices, hard disk, CDs, DVDs, and types. Information owners and information custodians must ensure that media that is no longer required operationally. For example, due to expiry, surplus, damage, or wear, is disposed of securely. And prior to disposal, the Ministry of Records officer must be consulted. Media disposal procedures must be documented and communicated to employees. We have to specify erasure and disposal measures whose strength is based on information sensitivity and type of media. Example, erasing all software or any software. Include secure disposal or destruction of media if erasure is not sufficient or not cost effective. Destruction by shredding, incineration, or chemical dissolution. Include audit logs of media disposal to be accountable. It makes it easier to be accountable. Media, so we've been talking about media handling. How do we handle media? Media handling is very important. Media handling, and because most of the media, the asset of the organization, of the government, is in the media, computer medium, or ICT infrastructure is more like media. So handling of media is very important. Within this policy, we've identified the areas on the steps to follow or the procedures to follow to make effective handling of the media. The physical media transfer has to be considered. Therefore, media containing information shall be protected against unauthorized access, misuse, or corruption during transportation. The media being partly transported from one vicinity to the other or venue to other must be appropriately protected. The following procedure must be followed. Media, the Office of the Government Chief Information Officer must document and implement security measures for the protection of media during transport that meet information classification handling requirements. If information of various classification is stored on media, the media must be protected according to the highest classification of information stored. Minimum media transport requirements are using couriers that are approved by government, inspecting identification credentials of couriers upon pickup and delivery of packages, obtain and retain receipt for media shipments, using packaging that will protect the media from loss or damage, and packaging so that the classification of the media is not displayed. The responsibility, therefore, we have the responsibility for specification of physical transport procedures are shared between Corporate Information Records Management Office, the Risk Management Branch, and Government Security Office. They have the responsibility to make sure that the transportation of media or transporting media from one place to another is done properly and according to the policy given, policy written, and the standard stated in the asset management policy. And this brings us to the end of the asset management policy. But within that, we have The document was prepared based on the asset supporting documents in reference to the ISO IEC 27001, 2013, Section 8, Asset Management, ISO 27005, 2011, Section Annex B, Identification, Valuation of Assets and Impact Assessment. So within there, there's notes of the description of what an asset is: software asset or primary asset, business process activities, information, hardware, software, network, and organization structure. So then the document management, a revision of the document, ownership of the document, and the revision of the document that is being prepared is stated at the bottom, at the end of this, of the document. So far, I've covered all the areas within the document, this asset policy document, and therefore, if you have any, we have any contributions where there's any clarification, we can discuss it and clarify it, and that everybody will be well informed of the composition of the contents of this policy. Contains introduction, purpose, objective, scope, policy statement, asset management, and we have the responsibility for the assets, information, classification, media handling. Then we support the document. Within the document, you have the supporting and reference documents and then document management. That brings me close to the presentation.